Redditor 1. I was 14 years old, maybe 15, when I found myself huddled in a cramped wooden cabin with 20 or so fellow Boy Scouts, all of us on edge as midnight closed in. We were on a weekend shooting trip, rifles by day, spooky campfire stories by night, the usual drill. The cabin was a simple structure, windows at the front and back, tables lining the walls, and 2 doors leading out into the pitch-black woods. Our adult leaders had their own cabin about an eighth of a mile away, connected only by a gravel road that twisted through the trees. Somewhere past midnight, I realized I needed to make a trip to the bathroom, which was inconveniently back in the adults' cabin. I was no fool. I asked my friend to tag along with me. We were Boy Scouts after all, so traveling alone at night was out of the question. And bears roamed these woods. That knowledge alone was enough to set our nerves on high alert. So he grabbed our pocket knives before we headed into the dark. We figured a couple of flimsy blades would be better than nothing if a bear decided we looked like a midnight snack. The walk to the bathroom went smoothly enough. Just the crunch of gravel under our boots, the distant flicker of moonlight on the trees. We cracked a few jokes to calm our nerves, listened intently for rustling sounds, but everything stayed quiet. After taking care of business, we started the trek back. That's when something in the air changed. An uneasy feeling settled over us like a weight. I can't explain it clearly, only that my gut screamed, "Run!" My friend, glancing at me, must have felt the same thing because he quickly flicked open his knife and I did the same. We picked up the pace, trying not to look like terrified prey, though I'm sure our faces betrayed us. I forced myself to breathe steadily, scanning the trees. Then I saw it. At first, my brain tried to label it as a cat, like a stray bobcat or maybe a large lynx, but it was standing on its hind legs, hunched over, easily 6 feet tall or more. Its silhouette looked impossible, too lean in the torso yet broad at the shoulders, with 2 points for ears or horns. The moonlight cast a faint glow along its outline, and what I remember most were its eyes, reflective, like an animal's caught in headlights. I couldn't help it. A jolt of sheer panic surged through me. My heart hammered in my chest as my adrenaline spiked. My friend saw it the exact moment I did. He let out a low, startled expletive, and we both bolted, knives clutched in our fists, gravel spraying behind us. That's when we heard the noise, a twisted, half-moaned half-howl that pierced the night air. It was close, too close. I dared a backward glance and caught a glimpse of that tall, cat-like shape shadowing us, loping along at a slow, almost deliberate pace. Its voice echoed in the darkness, a warped cry that made every hair on my neck stand up. The cabin never felt so far away. My lungs burned as we sprinted, my mind racing with impossible thoughts. What if it catches us? What if it's some creature no one's ever seen? What if it's a person? But it didn't move like a person, and it certainly didn't sound like one. Finally, the cabin's dim porch light appeared around a bend. We pounded up the steps, slamming on the door with our fists, voices cracking as we yelled for the others to open up. Inside, the rest of our troop, maybe 15 or so guys, scrambled to unlock the door. The moment the latch clicked, we stumbled in, nearly collapsing onto the floor. "What happened?" someone asked, scanning our flushed faces. We spat out the story in a breathless jumble. "Something's out there, like a giant cat, but on 2 legs. It's following us." To our relief, they didn't dismiss us as delusional. The mood in that cabin changed instantly. A couple of scouts peered outside through the front window while someone else fumbled with the back door. It had no lock, just a simple handle, not good. We shoved a heavy wooden table against it, stationed one kid there with his knife drawn, hands visibly shaking. Another scout pulled down the blinds on the windows where possible, except for one window with no blinds at all. Then we saw them, 2 reflective eyes at that uncovered window, just staring in. I can't describe the terror that clutched me at that sight. It was as though our worst fears took physical form, peeking through the glass. We couldn't see the rest of the creature's body, just those glowing pinpoints, slightly higher than a person's head level. A shiver ran through all of us, and the cabin was dead silent except for ragged breathing. Suddenly, a thump at the back door. It wasn't a full-on slam, more like something testing it, nudging it around the edges. The kid standing in guard leaned against the table with all his weight, white-knuckled fingers wrapped around his knife handle. Another moaning howl, so close it rattled the pit of my stomach. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the noises faded. The eyes vanished from the window. We waited, hearts racing, for any sign the creature would try another angle, but nothing happened. Slowly, way too slowly, the tension began to ease, replaced by a trembling, uncertain relief. We whispered among ourselves, guessing what it might have been. A bear with mange? Some escaped exotic pet? A coyote standing weirdly upright? None of our theories made sense, and nobody dozed off that night. We stayed with every light in the cabin burning until dawn. When morning finally broke and the adults came by to check on us, we rushed to explain. They listened, then exchanged knowing looks and scoffed. They assumed we'd hyped each other up with scary stories until a shadow or branch became a monster, but we knew we weren't imagining it. Several of us had seen the eyes, heard the howling. My friend and I had laid eyes on the beast itself, tall as a man, shaped like a predator that shouldn't exist. Sure, maybe we'll never have definitive proof. We didn't snap a photo, and come daylight, there was no trace, no strange footprints, no fur snagged on a branch. The adults wrote it off as overactive imaginations. But for those of us who were there, huddled behind a barricaded door with knives in hand, that night remains burned into our minds. Sometimes, after the fact, you can't quite shake the feeling that there are things in the woods that defy explanation, waiting just beyond the circle of your campfire light. Even now, when I see a dark stretch of forest illuminated by moonlight, I remember the hushed panic in that cabin, the eyes glaring back at us, and the haunting cry that sounded like something caught between an animal and a nightmare. Whether you call it a cryptid, a trick of the mind, or a simple case of mistaken identity, one thing is certain. That night, we believed. And no amount of daylight can fully take that chill away. Redditor 2. I've been living out here in the middle of nowhere for the better part of a decade. It's so far from city lights that I can stand out on my porch at night and see the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a luminous river, unobstructed by smog or skyscrapers. Most people would find it peaceful, but to me it's a little eerie, especially since I'm a smoker and a dyed-in-the-wool night owl. I step outside for a cigarette at 2 in the morning, and there's nothing but quiet farmland and open sky. Sometimes, though, that quiet is exactly what unsettles me. In all those years, I've seen my share of oddities in the night sky. Little points of light that zip across the horizon, then suddenly change direction and shoot off at unbelievable speeds. I've read enough to guess that meteors can graze the atmosphere and deflect away, or maybe some were satellites doing something tricky, but who knows? The rational part of me wants to say it's just normal cosmic phenomena. The imaginative part of me wonders if they could be something else. After all, what do I really know about advanced technology or the vastness of space? Still, I've always figured that if an intelligence advanced enough to travel light years to Earth, they wouldn't bother to slap bright spotlights on their ships like a highway patrol cruiser. Despite seeing these dancing lights on about a dozen different occasions, I rarely got the goosebumps the way I did one muggy summer night a few years back. It was the kind of night when cicadas should have been screaming from every tree, when the wind should have carried the hum of crickets. But the moment I stepped outside, I realized something was off. I couldn't hear any of those usual nighttime bugs. The stillness was absolute, so quiet I could practically hear the thudding of my own heartbeat. That's when I noticed it. A shape, blacker than the surrounding sky, floating overhead. Imagine a big metal thermos, just an oblong, cylindrical form, drifting across the stars. It had no lights, no glow, no faint outlines. Nothing about it stood out except its sheer blackness and the fact that it visibly obscured the stars behind it as it moved. I couldn't hear a single sound from it. No engine roar, no whir of machinery. I just stood there, cigarette forgotten between my fingers, feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck. It moved slowly, almost as if it was in no particular hurry, sliding across my field of view. It reminded me of a submarine drifting through dark waters, only this was high above me in the open sky. Every second I expected it to vanish or accelerate, but it just kept going on that steady path until it disappeared behind a copse of trees. Then I realized my heart was pounding, my skin clammy with adrenaline. Of course, I told my family about it the next day. My husband gave me a thoughtful look, but ultimately shrugged. My kids sort of rolled their eyes, more interested in cartoons than potential UFOs. I tried to pass it off as some secret military drone or a balloon, but deep down I felt uneasy. Balloons don't move that smoothly, that silently, and drones usually have at least some lights or a faint hum. The next time I stepped out for a late smoke, I caught myself half hoping to see it again, half terrified I would. Time passed, and the memories started to fade into the background of daily life, cooking dinner, paying bills, mowing the yard. Then, about a year ago, my husband shook me awake in the middle of the night. I'm a heavy sleeper, so he basically had to prod me multiple times. By the time I was conscious enough to respond, he was already babbling about seeing something huge crossing the sky. In my groggy state, I mumbled something incoherent, and the next thing I knew, I drifted back to sleep. The following morning, over coffee, he brought it up again. He said he'd gone out for some air around midnight, couldn't sleep, maybe too much caffeine. He stepped onto the porch and caught sight of a massive black object overhead, gliding through the sky in utter silence. Unlike my cylinder, he described, this one is shaped like a chevron or a boomerang, its edges faintly lit by a row of small lights along the bottom. He only saw it for a few seconds, but it gave him an immediate sense of dread. He tried to wake me so I could see it too, but I was dead to the world. As he talked, my mind flashed back to the summer I'd seen that oblong silhouette. The hush that descended over the fields, the stars winking out behind its shape. The similarities gave me goosebumps all over again, even though he swore up and down the shape was totally different. Maybe there's more than one kind of craft flying around out here, or maybe they're just drones from the local Air Force base. He admitted it left him feeling uneasy for days, the same way I'd felt. We found ourselves comparing notes, half laughing about it but half serious, trading theories. Could these be experimental military planes that somehow suppress all sound? Could they be illusions caused by strange cloud formations? The only thing we both agreed on was that these sightings were not normal airplanes. Planes don't creep through the sky without so much as a whisper of engine noise. Planes have at least some visible lights or navigation beacons. These objects glided silently, darker than the night around them. And it wasn't just the silence in the sky, it was the silence on the ground. Both times the world around us seemed to hush. No insects, no rustling leaves, no distant coyotes howling, like nature itself was holding its breath. Even in the hottest parts of summer, you can count on cicadas and crickets to be relentless. So why did they fall silent both times? My husband and I still watch the sky from our porch. Most nights we see nothing unusual, just the regular tapestry of stars, an occasional shooting star, or the faint pulsing lights of a high-altitude jet. But every so often, we catch a glimpse of something moving in a way that defies logic, or we hear the sudden hush of insects stopping mid-chorus, and we exchange a knowing look, remembering those nights when we saw shapes that shouldn't exist. We don't expect anyone to believe us, really. People shrug and say, "You probably just saw a plane," or "It was a trick of the light," or "Maybe you were half asleep." That's fine, we can't prove anything. All I know is that there's a particular brand of dread that hits you when you see something you can't rationalize, something you can't label as a meteor or a drone or a balloon. It lodges in your mind, stirring up questions about what might share our world, questions that have no easy answers. So we keep living our quiet life out here, far from city lights, far from traffic and noise. It's not like we're constantly looking over our shoulders. Most nights remain uneventful, but every time I step onto the porch for a midnight smoke, a tiny shiver runs down my spine, a silent question hanging in the cool air. Will tonight be the night I see it again? And maybe that's the real legacy of these encounters. Not conclusive evidence or dramatic revelations, but the subtle shift in how you perceive the darkness and the sky above. Once you've glimpsed a silent shape that defies explanation, you never quite lose that sense of possibility and that underlying tremor of fear. Redditor 3. I remember the crisp bite of the early winter air up in the White Mountains of Arizona, where the pine trees seemed to brush against the sky and every breath smelled of cold evergreens. My family had this tradition, driving up each year to find and cut down our own Christmas tree. We'd make a day of it, pack the truck with snacks, warm jackets, a thermos of hot chocolate, and our German short-handed pointer, who insisted on coming along for any ride that hinted at adventure. That day, about 10 years ago, we'd piled into my dad's old pickup. My grandpa sat in the front passenger seat, hat pulled low over his brow, his ever-present thermos of coffee in hand. My mom and sister squeezed together in the back. I, always preferring the open air, stationed myself in the bed of the truck with our dog, a lanky pointer with a brown and white coat, endlessly energetic and curious. He became my savior. We navigated a winding forest road. The truck bumped along ruts and rocks, the tall pines rising on either side. I leaned against the side rail of the bed, the dog at my feet, both of us content to watch the forest roll by. Snow dusted the ground, not deep but enough to give everything a fresh, gleaming look under the sun. Then, out of nowhere, my dog started to growl. Low, guttural, the kind of growl that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. My gaze snapped in the direction he was looking, expecting maybe a bear or a mountain lion. We'd seen black bears up here before. They weren't common, but not unheard of. But this time, what I saw didn't resemble any normal forest animal. Roughly 60 or 70 yards away, moving parallel to the road, was a tall, dark figure. Not just dark, more like deep brown or black, blending against the tree trunks. At first I tried to rationalize it. Could it be a hunter in dark clothing, someone wearing a coat with a hood? But the shape was bulky, the arms too long, and it moved with a strange, even gait, almost gliding among the trees. My heart pounded. The dog's growl turned into an urgent bark, as though warning off a threat. Without taking my eyes off that shape, I slammed my fist against the back window. "Dad, stop the truck!" I shouted over the roar of the engine and the dog's barking. When he finally hit the brakes, I yelled that I thought I saw Bigfoot. There was a moment of silence from the cab before my dad let out a scoffing laugh, the kind of laugh that said he thought I was joking or maybe had lost it. "All right, Bigfoot, sure," he said, stepping on the gas again. The truck jerked forward, lurching back into motion. I twisted around, trying to keep the creature in sight, my heart hammering with excitement or fear, I'm not sure which. The figure turned off its original path, angling away from the road. I craned my neck over the side rail for one final look. Through the trees, I saw the top of its head, a broad dome of dark fur or hair, disappearing down a slope. And then it was gone, swallowed by the forest. My dog kept barking, nails scratching the metal bed. I stood there, straining to see if it might reappear. It never did. The world felt strangely quiet all of a sudden, the moment punctuated by the rumble of the truck's engine and the swirl of dust we left behind. When we finally stopped for lunch or to scout out a possible Christmas tree, I jumped out of the truck, breathless, practically colliding with my dad. "I'm telling you, Dad, I saw something," I insisted. "It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person. It was too tall." My dad just gave me a good-natured grin, the same grin he wore when one of us kids told tall tales. He didn't outright call me a liar, but I could see he didn't believe a word of it. Over the years, whenever the topic of weird wildlife sightings or Bigfoot came up, my dad would needle me. "Hey, remember the time you thought you saw Bigfoot up in the White Mountains?" Everyone would laugh. He'd have me retell the story like it was some campfire legend, and I'd go along with it, describe the dark shape, the way it walked, how the dog reacted, but the moment remains crystal clear in my memory. The hush of the forest broken by barking, the fleeting glimpse of something not quite right. Could it have been a very large man in dark clothing out hunting? Possibly. Could it have been a trick of the light or shadows cast by tall pines? That's what my dad always half suggested. Yet even my dog's reaction was so intense, like he sensed an unfamiliar predator. There's a certain primal alarm dogs give when they confront something genuinely threatening or unknown. And that's the bark I heard. My grandpa, for his part, just shrugged when I told him. "Kids have wild imaginations," he'd say. But he was also the kind of man who believed the forest held more secrets than we knew. Sometimes, late at night, he'd share stories about unusual footprints he'd come across or the weird howls he once heard while camping alone. He never came out and said Bigfoot was real, but he never ruled it out either. I don't know what I saw that day. I only know I saw something. It was too tall, too broad in the shoulders, too smooth and steady in its movements to be a standard animal. I can still picture the silhouette, the top of its head as it vanished over the hill. That image stays with me, no matter how much my dad likes to tease or how often people roll their eyes. In the end, we found our Christmas tree. A perfect spruce, if memory serves. We loaded it into the truck bed, my dog panting nervously by my side as though still wary from the encounter. On the drive home, my family sang carols and joked around, everything returning to the comfortable, familiar normalcy of the holidays. But for me, a thin thread of wonder and unease wove itself into that year's memory. Sometimes I catch myself reliving that moment, the hush of the forest, the shape prowling along in the distance. It never fails to send a little jolt through my chest. So go ahead and laugh if you want, the way my dad still does sometimes. But I'll always wonder, was there something watching us from among those pines, something we humans rarely get the chance to see? I can't say for sure. All I know is that for a few seconds, one snowy day in the White Mountains, I felt the prickling awareness that maybe we're not alone out there. And maybe the woods still have some mysteries left for us to stumble across when we least expect it. Redditor 4. I was 10 years old the summer my fourth group class took that fateful trip to camp. They called it an outdoor education experience, but in typical kid fashion, I treated it like a long field trip where I'd get to paddle a raft, eat questionable cafeteria food, and sneak away with my friends to look at contraband magazines smuggled from home. The plan was for us to spend 4 days in the woods, bonding over campfires and nature hikes. I lasted barely 2. Even now, whenever I revisit those memories, I feel a lingering chill creep up my spine. What started out as innocent fun and mild mischief turned into the most harrowing event I've ever experienced. Something I still struggle to explain. Early days at camp. We arrived on a Monday morning, the buses groaning to a halt on a gravel road surrounded by tall pines. The counselors herded us into the central clearing where the mess hall, a few cabins, and a rickety old shack that housed the showers were situated. A wide dirt trail snaked off into the deeper part of the forest, leading to more cabins and, apparently, a lake. We trudged across packed earth, each of us gripping our duffel bags, sleeping bags, and pillows, trying not to trip over tree roots that bulged through the ground. The first day was pretty standard. We settled into our respective cabins. Mine was a creaking wooden structure that I shared with half a dozen other boys my age. Bunk beds lined the walls, and a single bare light bulb dangled from the ceiling. Our counselor, Mr. Stokes, was a tall man with a booming voice, who handed out rules like candy. No wandering alone, no going to the showers at night, no leaving your cabin after lights out. Typical camp stuff, but, of course, being kids, we were more interested in messing around than following rules. That night, we roasted hot dogs over a bonfire and told scary stories. One kid bragged about having found some R-rated magazines. Another teased about local legends of bear attacks. But I'd been to camp before in other places and heard it all. The cautionary tales about boogeymen, werewolves, or whatever else lurked in the woods. Usually, it never amounted to more than a raccoon knocking over a trash can. Little did I know how drastically that was about to change. The late night. Fast forward to my second night at camp. I'd volunteered, or maybe I was tricked, to help clean up the mess hall after dinner. It wasn't exactly glamorous, picking up granola bar wrappers, wiping down sticky picnic tables, hauling the trash out to a locked bin. By the time I finished, most kids were already back in their cabins, winding down or passing around comics by flashlight. My hair was greasy from a full day of activities, drafting, hiking, and general boyish chaos. So I decided to shower before turning in. Only problem? The shower building was a good walk away from the main cluster of cabins. Normally, kids were expected to shower before dark, in groups, carrying decent flashlights, precisely to avoid getting lost or freaked out. But I was feeling confident, or stupid. I grabbed a ratty old lantern from the mess hall, a leftover piece of junk that gave off barely enough light to see my own feet, and headed to the showers alone. It was pitch black outside, the moon partially obscured by drifting clouds. The soft hum of insects and occasional hoot of an owl set the soundtrack for my solitary walk. I remember passing by a sign that read, "Showers," with an arrow, faintly illuminated by my lantern's sickly glow. The whole trail felt claustrophobic, like the trees were leaning in, trying to listen to my footsteps. The shower encounter. The showers themselves were primitive. Concrete floors that sloped toward a rusty drain, curtained stalls barely tall enough for older kids, and a single overhead light flickering like it was seconds from dying. There was no one else around. The hiss of water against tile echoed in the small space as I tried to scrub off the grime of the day. Halfway through my shower, I heard a loud shuffling sound outside, like something scraping against gravel or dry leaves. I froze, heart pounding. In a place like that, your mind jumps to the worst-case scenarios, a bear sniffing around, or maybe bullies from another cabin plotting a prank. But as I strained to listen, the noise stopped. Figuring it was just my imagination, I hurried to rinse off, not wanting to linger in the open. I turned off the shower, toweled off as quickly as I could, and dressed in my pajamas and a hoodie. My plan was simple: get back to the cabin fast. But the moment I stepped outside, my instincts screamed that something was wrong. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets felt distant, almost muted, and a chill crawled up my spine despite the summer air. I could see the path ahead, but just barely, lit by that pathetic lantern. The darkness beyond my little bubble of light felt alive, running in the dark. The path was narrow and twisted through thick clumps of trees. I kept my lantern held out at arm's length. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, convinced something was trailing behind me. Then, without warning, I heard it. A moan. Long, low, and undeniably close. It wasn't a human groan. It sounded like an animal in pain, but deeper, more resonant, like it came from something with enormous lungs. I froze. My lantern wavered, casting wild shadows on the trunks. The moan sounded again, even louder, from directly in front of me. In panic, I screamed, dropped the lantern, and bolted the opposite way. All sense of direction vanished. I just knew I had to get away from whatever made that horrible sound. Within seconds, I was running blind through the dark, the forest swallowing me up. My feet caught on roots and rocks, and I stumbled. Something soft and wet broke my fall. I felt the squish of flesh under my hands, and my palms came away sticky. A metallic tang filled my nose. A smell I recognized even at 10 years old as blood. My stomach flipped. I was touching something dead, or worse, something dying. The moan echoed again behind me, no more than a few yards away. Pulse roaring, I leapt off the body, whatever it was, and sprinted toward what I hoped was the direction of the cabins. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. Keep running, keep running, keep running. Rescue at the cabins. At last, I saw flashlights bouncing through the woods. A group of campers and counselors were headed my way. The moment they spotted me, I saw their beams shift to my face, then down to my shirt, and a collective gasp. I didn't understand at first, until I looked down and realized I was smeared in a dark, sticky liquid. A counselor rushed forward and nearly dropped his flashlight. "Oh God," he muttered, "are you hurt?" I tried to form words, but all that came out was a sob. Another counselor gently placed a hand on my shoulder. He was trembling almost as much as I was. They guided me back to the cabins, the other kids parting like I was radioactive. Some looked terrified, others morbidly curious. Mr. Stokes, my cabin counselor, was white as a sheet. He asked me over and over, "What happened? What did you see?" But my friends huddled around, trying to calm me, but I was beyond comfort. The memory of that wet, squishy mass beneath me and that guttural moan behind me played in my head on a loop. Eventually, they stripped off my bloody clothes and handed me a towel. Someone fetched a first aid kit, thinking I'd been wounded, but they found no cuts, at least none that explained the amount of blood on me. That realization made them all the more uneasy. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on a bunk in fresh clothes, shivering under a blanket, jumping at the slightest rustle of the wind against the cabin walls. The others in my group also stayed awake, eyes darting to the windows whenever a branch scraped the glass. Occasionally, we'd hear faint sounds in the distance, maybe an owl, maybe just leaves, but every time, I'd feel my heart skip a beat. I suspected all of them felt it too, like something was out there, circling around. By dawn, my eyes burned from exhaustion. The counselors did a head count and discreetly questioned me again, though I barely had the strength to talk. I only managed to say something about a moan, blood, and running. They exchanged grim looks, but nobody made a big announcement. Instead, they quietly asked me if I wanted to go home. I didn't hesitate. Within an hour, they'd called my parents and I was on my way back. What happened next? For a while, I tried to bury that memory, chalking it up to some horrifying accident. Maybe I'd stumbled onto a deer carcass a wolf had left behind. But the nightmares persisted. Then, months later, I got together with a friend from that same camping trip. Over soda and snacks, he admitted that after I left, the moaning returned, louder and more frequent. Campers claimed it came from just behind the cabins at night, and some even swore they saw dark shapes among the trees. He's scared of doing it very bitterly. One older kid said he found fresh footprints in the mud, large and oddly shaped. The counselors dismissed it all as overactive imaginations. Yet, the crowning detail, the one that brought it all back in a rush, was the news about the deer carcass. My friend told me how the counselors discovered a deer on the same trail I'd run down. Its head torn clean off, entrails piled next to it, as if deliberately removed. The gore matched the blood I'd been covered in. No one in the camp had a good explanation. A bear could do damage, sure, but the neatness suggested something else, something more violent or predatory in a chilling, calculated way. Even now I get goosebumps thinking about it. Ever so often, when people talk about bizarre encounters or unexplainable events, I can't help but replay that night in my head. Most folks dismiss it as a freak coincidence or say I must have been confused, maybe half dreaming. But the ones who were there, my friends who saw me run out of the woods drenched in blood, know the truth. They heard the moans at night. They saw the fear etched on every counselor's face. I still wonder what lurked in that forest. Was it just a bear, a big one with a taste for fresh kill, scaring a clueless kid half to death? Or was it something else, something that prowls in the dark corners of nature, rarely seen but always waiting? All I know for sure is this: that night changed how I view the quiet hush of the woods. Sometimes silence isn't peaceful. Sometimes it's the prelude to something dreadful, something that can't be easily named. I haven't set foot in those campgrounds since, and I have no intention of going back, because if I did, I'm not sure I'd be lucky enough to escape a second time. I've had strange encounters every night for as long as I can remember, but never quite like what happened when Uncle Bob died. I was about 8 years old at the time, old enough to understand that losing someone meant they'd never come back, but not old enough to handle how that might feel. Even before Uncle Bob passed, I'd been dealing with these weird, dreamlike apparitions. I have a condition called hypnagogia, which means that as I start to drift off to sleep, I sometimes see intensely vivid hallucinations. My parents called them night terrors in the beginning because they'd catch me screaming in my bedroom at shapes that weren't really there. But night terrors didn't quite capture the scope of it. I saw monsters with too many limbs, ghostly figures drifting through walls, alien heads peering around my doorframe, stuff that would send anyone into a panic. For me, it became a near nightly ordeal. I hated bedtime. It felt like an inevitable horror show each evening. My mom would tuck me in, say goodnight, and I'd spend the next few hours dreading the moment I began slipping into that half-dream state. More often than not, I'd see something, a looming figure at the foot of my bed or a shapeless shadow scuttling across the ceiling. I'd cry out, sometimes fling my pillow at it, and my parents would come rushing in, only to find nothing there. Over time, I learned these visions were a product of my own mind, fabrications conjured in the hazy space between wakefulness and sleep. But then Uncle Bob died, and everything changed. Uncle Bob was one of those family members everyone adored, always cracking jokes, always first in line to help if you needed something fixed or moved. He taught me how to fish one summer, showing an unbelievable patience with my constant chatter. So when he passed away, the entire family felt the blow. We went through the motions of the funeral, sitting in rows of folding chairs, enduring soft organ music, and listening to tearful eulogies. I remember feeling a quiet sadness, a child's realization that someone I loved was simply gone. That night, after we got back from the memorial service, we all tried to settle into some semblance of normal life. My mom made a subdued dinner, my dad watched TV listlessly, and I retreated to my room to read, half hoping it would keep my mind off things. When bedtime finally came, I braced myself for the usual haunted illusions. I drifted off at some point, not sure exactly when, and that's when I saw him, Uncle Bob. It was a dreamlike scene, but felt startlingly real. He walked right past my bedroom door, dressed head to toe in white shirt, white pants, even some kind of white shoes. He paused, turned to look at me, and gave the smallest nod, the hint of a warm smile on his face. Then he continued down the hallway, disappearing from my sight. What floored me was that this vision didn't scare me at all. Every other time I'd seen a figure in my room, ghostly or monstrous, I'd freaked out, pulse racing, my skin prickling with dread. But Uncle Bob felt different. There was something peaceful about his presence, almost comforting, like he wanted me to know he was okay. I fell back asleep without tears or trembling, which was a remarkable change from my norm. The next morning, I awoke with a peculiar sense of calm, still wrapped in the memory of that gentle smile. My parents and I gathered in the kitchen for breakfast. Normally, I kept my hallucinations or dream visions to myself. My parents knew about them, but I tried not to bring them up. I was pouring cereal, wondering if I should say something about seeing Uncle Bob, when my mom spoke first. She set her coffee mug down and said, "I had the strangest dream last night. I dreamt Bob came into my room. He sat down on the bed, just like he used to, and we talked for a little while. It felt so real." Her eyes teared up just a little. "I guess I'm just missing him." My heart dropped into my stomach. The cereal box froze in my hand. She'd seen Uncle Bob too, at the exact same time I'd seen him in my own room? The coincidence was staggering, enough to make my chest tighten with a surge of emotion I couldn't fully express. I blurted out what had happened, how I'd seen Uncle Bob in the hallway, how he'd paused to look at me, how it hadn't scared me like my usual visions. My mom's eyes went wide. She couldn't decide whether to be intrigued or concerned. My dad put down his newspaper, leaning forward. A silence fell across the table, heavy with something none of us could quite name. Finally, my mom shook her head and said, Maybe he was checking in on us both." That was all it took. Tears started rolling down my face, and I couldn't stop them. Something about the notion that Uncle Bob's spirit might have truly visited us was overwhelming. Until that morning, I'd been content labeling my nighttime apparitions as mere hallucinations, a quirk of my hypnagogia. Sure, it was scary, but it was explainable. But if Uncle Bob was real in that moment, it hit me hard. If I accepted the idea that Uncle Bob's presence was genuine, comforting even, then I also had to accept the possibility that other visions weren't just illusions. The monstrous shapes, the alien silhouettes, the half-formed ghosts in my peripheral vision, could some of them have been real too? The notion terrified me. For weeks, I wrestled with it. I'd lie awake at night, lights off, my pulse pounding, waiting for the usual flicker of movement in the corners of my vision. Every time I saw something, a shadow that looked too solid, a figure that seemed to drift across my floor, I'd find myself paralyzed with a new kind of dread. What if this thing is actually here? It didn't help that my parents tried to reassure me in contradictory ways. My dad insisted that the visitation from Uncle Bob was a comforting dream shared between mother and son during a time of grief. My mom, on the other hand, half believed that Bob might have really returned for one final goodbye. They both agreed, though, that the other stuff I saw, aliens, ghosts, or nightmares, were likely the product of my hypnagogia. Logical maybe, but that didn't soothe the buzzing anxiety in my mind. Time passed, and I adapted. I became more accustomed to the hallucinations themselves, treating them like mental static. Doctors and therapists explained that hypnagogic hallucinations are indeed common in certain sleep disorders. They told me there was a boundary in my mind that got blurred when I approached sleep. To them, it was all purely internal, just my brain conjuring illusions. But that single memory of Uncle Bob continued to poke holes in my certainty. When I was about 14, I had a conversation with a new therapist. She listened politely as I recounted the story, nodding thoughtfully. When I finished, she said, "It could be a shared dream, a coincidence. Or maybe there are things we can't fully understand. Sometimes we find comfort in believing we've been visited by those we love." I found no absolute answers in her words. Yet, I decided not to let that experience rule my life. I had already grown skilled at ignoring the monsters and aliens that popped up when I was half asleep. I discovered that if I didn't react, didn't let fear flood my system, they vanished faster. The sightings became nothing more than shadows flickering at the edge of my vision, like old acquaintances I'd learned to tolerate. Still, every now and then, I revisit that night in my mind. My great-uncle passing by my door in his all-white attire, pausing to give me that soft, reassuring smile. My mom having her own dream. Bob sitting with her, maybe offering one last conversation. The coincidence remains too pointed to dismiss. Now that I'm older, I've reached a sort of inner truce. I allow myself to believe that perhaps Uncle Bob's spirit did come back, just once, to let us know he was okay, knowing how torn up we were about losing him. Maybe I was able to perceive it more vividly because of my hypnagogic state. In a strange way, it's comforting. But the flip side is that question that still lingers in the corner of my thoughts. If Bob was real, how many of those other apparitions were real too? Sometimes, late at night, if I see a shape in my doorway or an alien-like face in the mirror, I feel a flash of genuine terror. Yet I remind myself that not everything in life can be pinned down to cold logic or easy categories like real versus hallucination. Maybe reality is bigger than we think. These days, I've come a long way from that scared kid who trembled at bedtime. I manage my hypnagogia with relaxation techniques and a more laid-back attitude. I rarely cry out anymore, even when the silhouettes appear. I simply acknowledge them and roll over, letting myself drift deeper into sleep. Sometimes, though, if a vision lingers a moment too long, I still remember Uncle Bob, his reassuring expression, and I wonder if some part of him stayed with me, quietly reminding me that not every apparition is a monster. I don't claim to have all the answers. If someone asks me whether I believe in ghosts or if spirits can visit us, I might shrug and say, I've had experiences I can't fully explain. That's the best I can do. Life doesn't always come with neat explanations or conclusive evidence. For me, I just accept that I've seen things that blur the line between real and unreal, and I've learned to live with that uncertainty. Maybe Uncle Bob's appearance was a gift that helped me realize not every supernatural glimpse is out to get me. Some might even bring comfort. And maybe that's enough to help me sleep at night, even when the shadows around me don't quite stay put. Redditor 6. I remember the first time it happened. I was a teenager, hanging out late at night in a local park with a group of friends. We were laughing, messing around, when suddenly we noticed a set of lights, red, blue, green, and white, slowly spinning in the sky. It was impossible to see a solid shape, but the pattern of the lights gave us the distinct impression of something plate-shaped hovering above us. We all fell silent, eyes glued to the sky for maybe 45 seconds, until those lights simply vanished in a blink. We stared at each other in that stunned, electric quiet, all thinking the same thing. That was not a plane, that was not a normal aircraft. We had no explanation. The second time, I was completely alone, lying on my back in the grass of my own backyard. I saw this silver disc hanging in the clear sky, looking for all the world like a weather balloon at first. Then it started moving around with these abrupt, precise motions, forming a perfect triangle path. Move, pause, each angle hit like clockwork. The speed of those jumps was unnerving, and I remember feeling my stomach tighten in fear and excitement. I watched for about a minute, breath held, until it vanished exactly like the first one had. No trace, no fading out, just gone. The third time, which happened about 4 years ago, was at a friend's party. We were all crammed in a garage listening to music, and I stepped out to the driveway to make a phone call. That was when I noticed a black, slightly reflective, plate-shaped object drifting overhead. By this point, I guess I was more exasperated than terrified. Like, why am I seeing these things yet again? I stood there, phone forgotten in my hand, eyes locked on this black shape for maybe 3 whole minutes. It hovered in place, impossibly still, and then the sky lit up with a blue flash. Almost like heat lightning, but definitely not the usual color. And the object was gone in an instant. A bunch of people inside the garage saw the flash of light too, but when I asked if they'd noticed anything strange in the sky, all they mentioned was that random blue lightning. That was the last time I ever saw one. I can't help wondering if I live near some secret military testing range, or if these sightings are something else entirely. It's bizarre to see a UFO once, let alone 3 times, and each time it scared the hell out of me. I'm just relieved it hasn't happened again, because the feeling of staring at something in the sky that shouldn't exist, completely powerless with no real answers, is not something I'd like to relive. Reddit. I was maybe 8 or 9 that summer, living way out in the middle of nowhere with my folks. Our closest neighbor was probably a 1/4 mile down the dirt road, and the nearest town with a gas station was half an hour away by car. We had woods stretching behind the house as far as you could see, and I spent most of my free time exploring them or catching fireflies in the evenings. I was crazy about those flickering bugs, and, for reasons I can't remember, obsessed with the idea of wild turkeys, even though they weren't supposed to roam our area. That night, I was out by the tree line, cupping fireflies in my palms and letting them go, trying to see how many I could catch before they disappeared into the dark. It was getting late, and the sky was this deep purple, with just a sliver of moon lighting up the yard. Crickets were chirping in a loud chorus that seemed to rise and fall. I was pretty focused on the fireflies until I heard something step on a stick. A real sharp crack that traveled through the hush. It got my heart pounding. I remember thinking maybe it was a turkey, so I took off running toward the noise, hoping I'd see one in the wild at last. But within seconds, I started feeling this deep, crawling sense of dread, like the moment you realize you've broken a rule and punishment is coming. My adrenaline spiked, and I froze in place. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and I scanned the tree line, every sense on high alert. That's when I saw them. Two glowing eyes, about 3 feet off the ground, staring straight at me from a gap between the trunks. They were yellowish and as big around as a baseball, reflecting what little light there was like a cat's would, except these were wider, unblinking, fixed on me with a strange intensity. I felt like a mouse pinned by a hawk's gaze, absolutely certain I was being sized up for something. My heart was pounding so hard it made my ears ring. Then those eyes began to rise, slowly, like someone standing up at a painfully deliberate speed. They went from 3 feet above the ground to 6 feet, maybe more. My breath caught in my throat, and the shape behind the eyes became clearer in the dim light. A huge silhouette, broad shoulders, towering above me in a way no animal I knew could. I remember thinking I'd never seen anything so large in the woods before. Then came the part that still gives me nightmares. I saw it open what looked like a mouth, dark against the dark, and its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing a glint of teeth. I can't say I heard a growl or a roar, but something about that motion was more terrifying than any sound could have been. All I remember is bolting, legs pumping, arms flailing, losing my breath in a wild sprint back toward the house. I reached the back porch in record time, heartbeat thrashing, tears in my eyes. I burst inside yelling about some monster in the woods, begging my dad to believe me. But he just gave me that stern look he got whenever I told a fib or stepped out of line. He refused to go check it out, told me to quit lying. When I wouldn't drop it, he took me into the kitchen and spanked me with the paddle for making up stories and sneaking off by myself at night. All I could do was sob, partly from the sting of the spanking and partly from the fear that maybe that thing was still out there, pacing the tree line, waiting. I never did figure out what those eyes belonged to. Over the years, I've told myself it might have been a trick of the moonlight on a large deer, or maybe a bear standing on its hind legs. But I'll never forget how it felt when those eyes lifted from child hint to adult hint, unblinking, and how its teeth glinted in the dark. Even now, if I close my eyes and let my mind wander back to that moment, I feel the same stab of fear and adrenaline. The next day, I tried to bring it up again, but my dad told me to quit my nonsense. So I stayed quiet after that, always wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something out there in those woods that didn't belong, something that met my gaze for a few seconds under the faint glow of fireflies before vanishing into the night. Redditor. I was 19 when my grandmother died. She hadn't been gone a month before the family gathered at her old house to sort through her things and handle all those painful little tasks that come with loss. I spent most of the day sidestepping the awkward talk about who was inheriting what, trying to ignore the dull ache in my chest that came from simply being in her space without her there. That house smelt the same, of old wood and a hint of lavender, but it felt hollow, as though a crucial piece of its soul had disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. My relatives had all found their corners of the house to bed down in, but I sat in the living room, flipping channels on her ancient TV until I landed on some vintage Nick at Night reruns. It was comforting in a mindless sort of way, the low hum of the old tube, the thick curtains keeping out the moonlight, and the dull glow of the screen casting shadows on the walls. I wrapped myself in a rough green and brown knitted blanket. A friend of mine had made it for me, and it was scratchy, but oddly reassuring. I must have dozed off around 2 in the morning, my head propped on the armrest of the couch. When I stirred again, the clock on the DVD player blinked 3:31 a.m. The house was silent except for the low mechanical buzz from the TV set, left on mute. The temperature in the room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. Even with that thick blanket, a shiver worked its way through my shoulders. I shifted, trying to gather the blanket around me more securely, and blinked a few times to clear the grogginess. That's when I saw her. My grandmother stood in front of me, just a few feet away. There was no haze, no translucent glow. She looked as solid and real as she had in life. Actually, she looked healthier, like she did before the last round of her illness took hold. Her hair was tidily pinned back, and she wore one of her favorite house dresses, the kind with small floral prints and pockets on the sides. She looked me straight in the eye, her expression firm, just like when she'd admonish me for staying up too late when I was younger. She spoke in that familiar voice, low and slightly scolding. "Go upstairs and sleep in a proper bed. Get moving." I didn't think twice about it. The part of my brain that should have screamed, "Wait, she's gone, this can't be real," was silent. It felt perfectly normal to take orders from her, the way I always had. So I nodded, pulled myself up off the couch, and rolled the blanket into my arms, dragging the trailing edge behind me as I headed for the steep staircase. She stepped aside, letting me pass, her gaze never leaving me, like she was making sure I obeyed. The hallway light was off, but the faint glow from some street lamp outside cast enough of a glow that I could see her silhouette, tall, confident, and oddly reassuring in the gloom. The old stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, and when I reached the landing, I glanced back over my shoulder. She was gone. No footsteps, no trace, just the living room in darkness. I felt a flicker of confusion, as if I'd missed something, but I was too exhausted to piece it all together right then. I found an empty bedroom, dropped the blanket, and fell onto the mattress, barely even noticing the stale sheets. I drifted back to sleep instantly, sinking into the dreamless void. The next morning, sunlight flooded through the windows, and I woke up with that knitted blanket bunched around my waist. For a moment, I forgot what had happened in the night, until I sat up, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and suddenly remembered my grandmother standing there, telling me to go upstairs. The realization hit me like a shot of cold water. She's dead. I staggered downstairs, half expecting to see her in the kitchen cooking breakfast or making coffee. My mom was at the table, flipping through some paperwork. I mumbled something about a weird dream, and she looked up. "What kind of dream?" she asked, taking a sip from her mug. I told her, haltingly, how I'd seen Grandma standing there, how she'd spoken to me like she used to when I stayed up too late, and how I'd obeyed without question. My mom didn't seem shocked, just nodded slowly and said, "That sounds like her all right. She never did like anyone sleeping on the couch." She didn't laugh, didn't chide me for my imagination. Instead, she gave me this half smile that said she believed me. It didn't surprise her at all that Grandma might show up one last time to fuss about my sleeping arrangements. But it shook me to my core. This was no fleeting vision in my peripheral vision, no hazy daydream. She was so real that part of me thought I must have half sleepwalked through it. Yet I could still feel the chill in the air, remember her voice. It wasn't terrifying, though. No sense of horror or dread. It was more like a final piece of guidance, a small act of care from someone who refused to stop being my grandmother just because she'd passed on. For the rest of that day, and even the weeks following, I kept replaying the scene in my mind. I'd catch myself hesitating at night, half expecting to see her again, to give me another directive or check on me. No such luck. She never reappeared, but that single moment was enough to remind me that some bonds don't simply vanish with death. Whether it was a dream or a genuine ghostly visit, it felt like her way of saying she wasn't quite finished watching over me. It's been years since that night, and the house has changed hands, but I still think about the old living room and that shabby couch. Sometimes, when sleep eludes me, I recall the memory of waking up around 3:30 in the morning with the TV's glow on the walls and seeing her figure so clearly. I remember her firmness, her caring sternness, and the sense of peace she somehow brought, even in the face of the impossible. Maybe she was just making sure I didn't ruin my back by sleeping in a cramped space. Maybe she wanted to let me know she was still around, still taking care of me in the small ways she always had. Or maybe it was just my own mind, conjuring her presence as I tried to cope with grief. Whatever the explanation, I'll never forget the calm that washed over me when I saw her, or the jolt of realization that came in the morning. That moment when I remembered she was gone, and yet somehow still there for me in that final gesture of grandmotherly concern. Redditor 9. When I was about 6 years old, my mother was working on her master's degree. She'd stay up late in the dining room with her textbooks, notebooks spread everywhere, and I'd often wake up in the middle of the night. Instead of crawling back into bed, I would head downstairs for a snack, an apple usually, and do a puzzle at the dining room table while she studied. She didn't always notice me come down. Sometimes she was too absorbed in her books. What I remember most vividly, though, was how I felt like I was literally floating through the dining room some nights, as if my feet weren't even touching the floor. I'd drift past the dimly lit furniture, feeling an odd weightlessness in the house's still darkness. On those nights, I tried calling for my mom. My voice sounded distant in my own ears, but it was as if she couldn't hear me. That's the part that always struck me as strange. How I'd yell for her, but she wouldn't respond. Her eyes were strange. Her skin was pale. Then everything would go fuzzy, and I would next wake up with her carrying me up the stairs, finding me asleep behind the dining room table on the floor. At the time, it didn't scare me. I was a kid, after all, and just assumed it was normal to have strange, half-sleep adventures at night. Maybe I believed I was dreaming. But years later, out of sheer curiosity, I looked up the history of our old house. That's when I learned that the first owners had died there. A tragic story of a couple who'd taken their own lives and that of their young son, who'd supposedly had red hair. The child's body had been discovered right in the same spot where I used to wake up on the dining room floor. My stomach turned when I read that. It felt impossible, yet the detail of the red-haired boy and the exact location hit me like a punch. I told my mom about it. She'd never breathed a word of the house's background to me before, and I saw the color drain from her face. She looked genuinely shaken, like she wished she'd never heard it. Until that moment, neither of us had made the connection between my weird nighttime floating experiences and anything supernatural. But looking back, it's hard not to wonder if there was more at play than just a child's imagination or some sleepwalking habit. Even now, when I think about those nights, about silently drifting through the dining room calling for my mom while she didn't hear a sound, I feel a cold rush of unease. Maybe I was just a restless kid, half dreaming as I wandered the house. Or maybe, in those quiet hours, something else joined me there in the dark, gently guiding me to the exact spot where another child's life had ended years before. All I know is that once I learned the truth, I could never dismiss those nights as simple coincidence again.